From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Fundamental changes going on in that part of the region if people behave correctly, if they're rational. On the other hand, we could see Israel winging it and doing a strike on its own against Iran at the nuclear targets that are pretty much dug in. They're under 75 feet of concrete, most of the enrichment facilities, and that could have unbelievable consequences.
We speak with legendary journalist Sy Hersh about his explosive article, Iran and the Bomb, How Real is the Threat? He says the U.S. might attack Iran because of distorted estimates of its nuclear and military threat, just like it did with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, then Haiti.
Haiti remains the only militarily occupied nation in the Western Hemisphere. It is suffering under the results of the earthquake, 1.3 million people still living under tents and tarps. Cholera has killed closing on 4,000 people, and no end in sight.
We speak with Kim Ives and Dan Coughlin, authors of a new report in collaboration with WikiLeaks called the Petro-Carib Files. Newly released documents expose how the U.S., with pressure from Exxon and Chevron, tried to interfere with and block an oil agreement between Haiti and Venezuela that would save Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, $100 million per year. Then former Los Angeles Black Panther leader Geronimo Gijaga Pratt dies in Tanzania. The target of COINTELPRO, he was imprisoned for 27 years before a judge vacated his wrongful murder conviction.
Charged because of a conspiracy by the government that was led by the Hoover, what we call the Hoover-Nixon regime, which was an illegal conspiracy directed against the entire left, entire movement.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. NATO continues to bomb the Libyan capital of Tripoli in the international campaign against Muammar Gaddafi. A Libyan official says NATO carried out at least 10 attacks earlier today. The strikes come hours after NATO extended its mandate to bomb Libya for another 90 days. In other Libya news, an alleged victim of rape by Gaddafi's forces has been deported from Qatar to the rebel-held east of Libya. The woman, Iman al-Obeidi, was detained in March after bursting into a hotel full of reporters in Tripoli and recounting her ordeal. She fled to Qatar shortly after being released. A friend of Obeidi says she didn't want to return to Libya and now fears violence for criticizing Libyan rebels. Violence continues to engulf the Yemeni capital of Sana'a in the ongoing standoff over President Ali Abdullah Saleh's refusal to step down. Yemeni forces reportedly fired on crowds of protesters today, following an earlier round of shootings on Thursday. Street battles, meanwhile, are continuing between Saleh's forces and anti-government tribal groups. At least 135 people have been killed in Sana'a in the past 10 days. Syrian forces are being accused of killing more civilians in the ongoing crackdown on protests challenging President Bashar al-Assad. The head of the Syrian Organization for Human Rights, Ammar Korabi, says at least 13 civilians were killed in the town of Rastan this week, while another 10 were killed in the town of Hirak.
We have names from Al-Hirak, 10 people who killed by the fire, and 4 of them as doctors who take the treatment and give the treatment about the injured people in the street. But unfortunately, they receive the fire from the assassination in the roof of the building surround these places.
The latest violence comes as exiled Syrian opposition groups have called on Assad to immediately step down. Meeting in Turkey, nearly 300 delegates issued a declaration demanding Assad's departure.
We are offering President Bashar al-Assad to resign immediately and transfer the authorities to his deputies so that the Syrian people within a year time can prepare themselves for a democratic process. If not, we are pressing in supporting the revolution in Syria in order to force him to leave Syria for Syrians.
The World Health Organization is warning that a strain of E. coli that's killed 17 people and sickened nearly 2,000 more in Europe may be the deadliest ever seen. The bacterium's believed to be a mutant combination of two different strains. According to the Washington Post, the bacterium that has caused the deaths would be legal in the United States if discovered on meat or poultry because of a regulatory oversight. That means there would be no way to prevent an outbreak were the strain to contaminate fruits or vegetables. The Obama administration says it's launched an investigation following news of a cyber attack against Google users originating in China. Google says hackers in China tried to break into the Gmail accounts of hundreds of people, including senior U.S. government officials. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said the FBI is examining the case.
Got the lead in this as an investigation. I'm not going to confirm anything about origins, except to say that we're aware of the reports and are obviously concerned about cybersecurity and have taken action accordingly.
The probe follows recent news the Pentagon has determined cyber attacks generated abroad may now constitute an act of war. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon's first-ever cyber strategy says attempts to sabotage the nation's electricity grid, subways or pipelines could be met with military force. The decision is expected to stir debate about whether the U.S. can ever be certain about the origin of a cyber attack and when the severity of attack constitutes an act of war. A high-level international panel has concluded the so-called war on drugs has failed and that governments should consider legalizing substances, including marijuana. The Global Commission on Drug Policies comprised of 19 members, including several former heads of state. Former Colombian President Cesar Gaviria urged the U.S. to begin debate on legalization.
We want the U.S. society to make a debate on these matters that has not been done because political leaders are a little fearful of the association between crime and narco trafficking, and it's very difficult to distinguish from consumers to users. But this society needs a debate. This society is spending $40 billion a year in fighting drugs. That is a lot of money. Has more than 500,000 people in jail. But they are spending that money in a way that is not effective.
Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney has entered the race for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination. Romney announced his candidacy in New Hampshire.
Barack Obama has failed America. When he took office, the economy was in recession, and he made it worse. It breaks my heart to see what's happening to this great country. These failing hopes make up President Obama's own misery index.
Several civil rights groups have filed a class action lawsuit seeking to block a recent Georgia law modeled on the anti-immigrant measure in Arizona. The law empowers local and state police to demand documentation of residency and to detain people they suspect are in the country without permission. State residents, including U.S. citizens, are required to carry documentation with them at all times. The suit was brought by a coalition including the American Civil Liberties Union and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the former Black Panther Geronimo Jijaga Pratt has died at the age of 63. In 1972, Jijaga was wrongfully convicted of the murder of Caroline Olsen. He spent 27 years in prison, 8 of those in solitary confinement. He was released in 1997 after a judge vacated his conviction. We'll have more on Geronimo Pratt later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Seymour Hersh is back in the news this week with another explosive article that is ruffling some feathers at the White House. During the Bush administration years, Hersh was widely criticized by White House officials for his exposés on the torture at Abu Ghraib, secret U.S. operations overseas, and U.S. policy in Iran. Now it is the Obama White House upset with an article from Hersh. Earlier this week, the New Yorker magazine published his latest investigation titled Iran and the Bomb, How Real is the Threat? Hersh writes, quote, there is a large body of evidence, however, including some of America's most highly classified intelligence assessments, suggesting that the United States could be in danger of repeating a mistake similar to the one made with Saddam Hussein's Iraq 8 years ago. allowing anxieties about the policies of a tyrannical regime to distort our estimations of the state's military capacities and intentions.
Seymour Hersh reveals that despite using Iranian informants and cutting-edge surveillance technology, U.S. officials have been unable to find decisive evidence that Iran has been moving enriched uranium to an underground weapon-making center. Hersh quotes Mohammad al-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, saying he has not seen, quote, a shred of evidence that Iran was weaponizing in terms of building nuclear weapons facilities and using enriched materials. The Obama White House, meanwhile, has repeatedly cited Iran's nuclear program as a threat to the world. President Obama raised the issue last month during his speech before AIPAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee.
So let me be absolutely clear. We remain committed to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Its illicit nuclear program is just one challenge that Iran poses. As I said on Thursday, the Iranian government has shown its hypocrisy by claiming to support the rights of protesters while treating its own people with brutality.
Joining us now in Washington is Seymour Hersh, investigative reporter at The New Yorker and author of many books, including Chain of Command, The Road from 9/11 to Abu Ghraib, currently working on a book looking at the Dick Cheney vice presidency. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Seymour Hersh. Lay out what you have found.
Well, very simply, it's you know, you could argue it's 2003 all over again. Remember WMD, mushroom clouds. There's just no serious evidence inside that Iran is actually doing anything to make a nuclear weapon. You know, making a weapon is a big deal. You have to have fabrication facilities. You have to convert a very toxic gas into a metal and then mold it into a core. It's big stuff, and there's no sign of any of it. We've been looking. Cheney was convinced, Dick Cheney, the former vice president, that there was a secret facility a la what we probably saw in the movie Bananas. Remember Woody Allen's movie, The Little Robots Running Underground? He was convinced that there was an underground facility somewhere. And we had special forces units in there since 2004, really, perhaps as late as early as 2005, maybe. Looking, we've been paying off people, the Kurds, the Azeris, the opposition groups. We've been giving a lot of money to various defectors. We've been looking with satellites for telltale signs, air holes, air vents, somewhere in the desert or somewhere in an arid area. And we found nothing. Not for lack of trying. We looked very hard. And there's just no evidence on the inside. And it's not only here. It's known in Europe. It's a much easier situation, at least for a journalist, to go to Europe because the European intelligence officials are much more open about it. Yes, we were very skeptical, they will say, but we found nothing. So the fact is we have the evidence is pretty strong, I mean very strong, that we have a sanctions program that's designed to prevent the Iranians from building a weapon systems they're not building.
And Hersh, your article details some extraordinary efforts by the United States. You talk about the special forces operations actually replacing street signs in Tehran with radiation detectors and replacing bricks in buildings. Could you talk about some of that? I mean, because that's enormous risk that they're taking, actually going into the country and doing that.
Oh, it's amazingly complicated. And I will tell you, obviously, I hate to write about operational stuff, but let me just say that whatever we were doing, we have a new generation now that's more sophisticated. But in those early days being 2005, 2006, there was a tremendous concern that various buildings, laboratories, and academic buildings in the city of Tehran were being used as secret facilities to enrich uranium to a high degree. Right now, the Iranians are absolutely within the law. That turns out they're signatories to the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there's no evidence whatsoever that the IAEA, that the group that Mr. El-Baradei headed, International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors nuclear developments, they consistently report that there's no evidence of any diversion of any of the enriched materials they now have. The Iranians are enriching to about 3.7 or so % to run civilian power plants. There's one small pilot project for medical research that gets up to 20%. But everything that's being enriched is under camera, under watch by the IAEA. There's just no sign of any diversion. There's just no evidence. This doesn't mean We can go to intent. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of concern in the United States, an appropriate concern about the Iranian intent. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't watch what they do, but it does mean that we're sort of beating a dead horse here.
Talk about your sources, Cy Hersh.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Look, there's been two very secret studies done called National Intelligence Estimates, NIEs, and these are the most sort of sacrosanct internal studies done by the community. Almost all the time they're private. There's studies going on, NIEs going on all the time. The situation now in Ecuador, for example, other issues. Venezuela's always looked at. The situation in the war. War-peace stuff is constantly being looked at by groups of people in the intelligence community, and these documents are promulgated without anybody knowing it. For some reason, in 2007, there was an NIE put out about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and the White House wanted a summary made. And I think at that point, 16 intelligence agencies were involved in the final conclusions. And internally, the guys running it, to their credit, voted 16-0 to say what they said, which is that in a summary put out about the NIE, as I say, unprecedented summary, saying there's no evidence they'd done any weaponization since 2003. And there's a new study that was just done. It was published in February of this year, and we knew about it, but nobody's actually. You're getting me in the tricky area, but I could just say people that have worked on the study and have read the study will have attested that it doesn't take us any further. There's no further evidence of any weaponization. And what's even more important that I write is that the latest study was actually supposed to be promulgated, is the word they use in the community, last fall, and it was delayed because the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon Intelligence Agency, had an assessment that was knocked everybody's socks off. Their assessment was the only reason Iran even looked at weaponization, and we're not talking about building anything, we're talking about doing studies, paper studies, was because they were frightened of Iraq. They'd had an 8-year war, as many in your audience will remember, between 1980 and 1988 with Iraq, a terrible, brutal war. And when their worry was that in the early, in the 2001-2002 period, that if Iraq went nuclear, they might need some deterrent. So what they even looked at, the papers they did, was aimed not at us or the Israelis, but aimed at the Iraqis. That didn't get into the final judgment, but it affected the debate in a pretty positive way.
And Cy Hersh, one of the things you say in your article is that these latest intelligence assessments, that a lot of the career intelligence people in the government now have pushed back a lot more against political pressure after the debacle with Iraq and the pressure on the intelligence community to skew intelligence assessments about weapons of mass destruction, that now the career people are a lot more willing to buck any political pressure.
You know, it really depends on who's running the agency. The Defense Department, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, has a career general named Burgess who's been in a lot of tough places. He was in this Joint Special Operations Command, and he really has. All I can say is, again, I'm getting the people who work for him will tell you that they're no longer afraid to go up against the established judgment. And so what we really have happening in an amazing way, and I have to say this about the American government because I'm always very critical, but we do have an enormous number of people in the government and the intelligence community who take an oath of office to the Constitution and not to the general who's in charge of them or to the president. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of attitude coming out inside. I can't tell you why, but there's more people really. There's a lot more concern about where we are in the world right now. In the last decade has been a pretty horrible one for the United States. And I think the future is very, very sort of frightening, too, in terms of what's been going on in the Middle East, et cetera. So there's more integrity in the process. It doesn't mean the White House likes it.
So I wanted to ask you about the new International Atomic Energy Agency report that came out Tuesday, just after your article was published. This is what the New York Times reported, quote, The world's global nuclear inspection agency, frustrated by Iran's refusal to answer questions, revealed for the first time Tuesday that it possesses evidence that Tehran has conducted work on a highly sophisticated nuclear triggering technology that experts said could be used for only one purpose, setting off a nuclear weapon. The 9-page report raised questions about whether Iran has sought to investigate 7 different kinds of technology, ranging from atomic triggers and detonators to uranium fuel. The New York Times reporting on the IAEA report. Your response, Seymour Hersh.
Well, the word evidence was not in what the IAEA said. What the IAEA said is something it's been saying repeatedly, even under El Baradi. And I must say, the new Director General, Mr. Amano, is, I think, more willing to please us than El Baradi was, just in terms of speculating more. There was nothing new in that report. They've been saying repeatedly that they have concerns about certain information they have. They don't describe it as evidence. The new trigger is a very complicated device that was used by us maybe 30 years ago to trigger a fusion weapon, and it went nowhere. And it's, as I say, extremely complicated device that there's no evidence that anybody in their right mind would want to use that kind of a trigger. It would involve creating a different kind of reactor. The technical problems with that kind of a complicated device are enormous. And anyway, are you really going to be? Are you going to make a trigger before you know what kind of gun you have? I mean, the word evidence was nowhere in the report. It's been going on a long time, and what's been going on is the IAEA has put out, this is even under El Baradi, for about 6, 7, 8 years now, they put out report after report that say one thing, that's the most important thing: no evidence of any diversion of enriched materials, no evidence that they're squirreling away enriched uranium to make a secret bomb. They have a lot of uranium enriched to 3.7%, yes. But there's no evidence they're doing anything more than storing it up to run a civilian nuclear reactor. They have 2 in the process now. They're having a lot of technical troubles, but eventually they're going to need that fuel. It takes an enormous amount of fuel to drive a reactor. And so it's the same thing that's been going on. You can look at the questions raised and lead your story with that, or you can look at the fact they say consistently that there's been no diversion. There are outstanding questions. The Iranians don't like being asked a lot of questions about third-party information, but they keep on coming back to the IAEA and saying, give us some reason to answer a question. We're not going to answer questions about third-party gossip, that most of which they believe comes from fabrications. And there's been some evidence that some of the material, particularly there's a famous laptop incident where there was material given to us, the provenance of which wasn't known, that we made a big fuss about, allegedly a laptop belonging to an Iranian scientist, nuclear scientist. There were very crude drawings in it. They weren't at all near the level of anything serious. And that for years back, about 4 or 5 years ago, fueled all sorts of debate. There's just the word evidence, I'll just say again, the word evidence was not in what the IAEA said. Yes, there are outstanding questions. The same questions have been asked and answered for years. This particular trigger device was written about in a London newspaper 2 or 3 years ago, a major story. It's not new. There's nothing known about it that hasn't been said before. This is what happens, alas. One thing about a free press is you don't have to like everything you read.
Well, so I wanted to ask you mentioned earlier the uprisings in the Arab world, and I wanted to ask you about the impact of those uprisings, both on the theocracy in Iran and also on Israel's attempts to constantly encircle Iran or portray it as the source of a danger to the rest of the world and to the region.
Well, just to get away from Iran for a second, what you're having now is you had it in Tunisia and you had Egypt, spontaneous people's revolts, if you will. Your former colleague was in Tahrir Square doing great stuff on it, and still in Cairo, I understand.
Sure.
And so
yes.
You had something amazing. Yes, you had something amazing going on. And what you have now, and that, of course, spread throughout the Gulf regions. And what you have now is a very, very, it's sort of unremarked upon by the press here in America. You have a counter-revolution going on, fueled largely by the Saudis and their panic. You see the implication of that in Bahrain, where the unbelievable things are happening to the Shiites, the minority Shiites there. They may be majority in terms of population, but certainly minority in terms of power. And you have that regime brutalizing its people in a way that's beyond, I would argue, anything going on elsewhere, including in Syria. As bad as it is in Syria, it's much worse in Bahrain. And the United States, of course, for a lot of reasons, is ignoring that. You have the Gulf states in a state of sort of controlled panic now. They're all sort of locally owned oil combines owned by various one-time Bedouin, desert livers, now suddenly owners of huge complexes of oil, billionaires, all of them, and they want to stay in power in the Gulf. Oman, even Qatar. You can see a lot of problems with Al Jazeera's coverage, particularly of Bahrain. Al Jazeera, for example, is always calling me, didn't call me for this story because everybody wants to point fingers at Iran. The United States is essentially equated Iran's upset and encouragement of some of the stuff going on with Bahrain. It's for the United States, this is as much of a sin as the Al Khalifi family beating the hell out of everybody and doing worse than that. Particularly doctors and nurses in Bahrain. So there's a huge
and it's the home of the
counter-revolution
US Navy
going
Fifth
on.
Fleet, Cy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It is the home, and of course the Fifth Fleet often wisely will move a lot of their vehicles offshore when trouble gets going. Yes, it's the home of Bahrain's an important base. It's an important facility, but we could go other places too. I'm sure. It's just we have a lot of things there. So you have the American response to you have this GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Committee. It's probably the only defense organization in the world that's designed for all the countries getting together to ward against internal dissent, not external threat, but internal threats. And so we have this amazing institution. Morocco just joined the GCC. So this is going on before our eyes, and we're not paying enough attention to it. And what we do is we focus on Iran as the bad guys. Iran's responsible. They're shifting gear to the Syrians to help the Syrian Mukhabarat control its society, as if the Ba'athist Party in Syria needs outside help in doing that. They're pretty good at it. We've made Iran into a boogeyman. And my own guess is the reason we're so intent on the sanctions and keeping on going when there's no evidence of any weaponization. There's no real threat at all. Even the Israelis, I was in Israel in April, 2 months ago now. And they have crazy strange ground rules on what you can report. But I can tell you right now, the Israelis understand, the more sophisticated ones and the serious people in the intelligence community there, they understand that Iran doesn't have a bomb now. If it decides to get one and they get a bomb, they're not going to throw it against Tel Aviv because they know that's annihilation. They understand that, despite the fact they say different things and they raise the threat. So we're making the Iranians sort of the people responsible for what's going on in terms of the revolutions, and we're really on the wrong side of history on that, the United States. It's really the Saudis we should be looking at quite a bit. And when you get to that question, you then say, here are the Saudis who obviously we know from reports and from everything I've been told are very angry at us. They feel that our support for Mubarak undercut them. They like to keep rigid control over a population that includes certainly in Saudi Arabia many Shiites who work the oil fields. And so you have the Saudis in full panic, refusing, in anger at us, refusing to increase the oil output. So the price of oil stays, gasoline is $4 or more a gallon. And here you have a president whose re-election is going to depend not on killing Osama bin Laden, hooray, he did it, but more on what the price of gasoline is going to be next year. And we have the Saudis stiffing us. And here you have Iran, which is the second largest producer of natural gas in the world, also has a lot of oil. Its fields are diminishing, but it's got a lot of stuff. The sanctions aren't working. The Iranians are selling stuff to India, to China, Pakistan. They're doing a lot of business. You think, Dumb and Dumber. You think maybe we would start doing what a lot of people in the article I published, Tom Pickering, the former Undersecretary of State, a longtime ambassador, very serious guy, is among those who's been doing involved in secret contacts with the Iranians and has been telling us for years, he and his group, get off this nuclear business. There's a lot of other issues you can deal with the Iranians. They want to be respected. You could really get some progress, and maybe even getting to the point where we don't have to, we're not interested in changing the regime there. That's impossible. We do know that, unlike Bush and Cheney. Obama doesn't want to. Maybe we can get to the point where you can start getting some of the energy that they have to produce. Instead, we're trying to keep them from the market. It just doesn't make sense. And sanctions, you know, go ask Castro how well they work. We've been sanctioning Cuba, since 1960, 61, 62. And, you know, and as far as I know, Cuba's still there, and so is Castro.
Cy Hersh, very quickly, we haven't spoken to you in a while.
Well, sorry, my earphone popped out. Hold on a second.
Okay, we're talking to the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Seymour Hersh. Cy, we haven't talked to you in a while. Your assessment of President Obama's war in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Disaster, stupid. I do think that the White House really wanted the Bin Laden raid, about which I've been doing a lot of work. Things are always more interesting than they seem. I'm not suggesting he wasn't killed or anything like that, but just more interesting. And I think the getting of Bin Laden will give Obama the freedom to make a serious cut in this war in Afghanistan that everybody on the inside, believe me, I don't know about Petraeus, General Petraeus, who for some reason is going to the CIA, just as for some reason Panetta, who doesn't really know much about the Pentagon, is going to the Pentagon. I don't quite understand what they're doing, but this is a war that has nothing to do with American national security. And the obvious way out is to actually find a way to start talking to Mullah Omar. Instead, we keep on isolating him, and we're driving Pakistan crazy with this war. We're increasing the jihadism there. We're increasing the terrorism there. We're sticking it to the Paks in very direct ways. It's a totally counterproductive system. We have our guys going out doing night raids. We always call them NATO, and the press goes along with calling them NATO. But our Joint Special Operations Command is still going out. I don't fault the guys doing it. Let me make it clear. They're very, very competent guys. They're under orders, and they do what they do. They just do it very well. But there's no way you're going to make strikes at night and not kill an awful lot of non-combatants, collateral damage, they call it. And it's just we're hated. We're outsiders. We don't have to be doing the bombs to be hated by the Pashtun. That's been the society all along. The Pakistanis are in terrible fear of what's going to happen in Afghanistan. They always see Afghanistan as a bulwark against India. They're afraid of our relationship with India. And I'll tell you, the biggest problem he has, as awful as those things are, as counterproductive, and as much as he's following, oh yes, Bush and Cheney in those policies, and I think the president, I'll be writing about this, I think he was really sandbagged by the Pentagon after he got into office, when he was new and innocent. And I think right now, I'd almost use the word cult to describe what's going on in the White House. Everything's political. He's isolated. Very good people say they've never seen a president this isolated in terms of being unable to get to him with different opinions, etc. So he's really captive of a few people there. I know this may sound strange, but I know what I'm talking about. You can't get to the guy. And even, for example, Pickering, as competent as he is, and Pickering's done some wonderful stuff for the United States intelligence community undercover, and so he's known as a trusted guy. Those guys who've been involved in talking to Iran off the record, track 2 policy talks for years, can't get to the president. He may not even know they're looking for him. I just don't know. And so here we have this very bright guy continuing insane policies that are counterproductive, do nothing for the United States, and meanwhile, the real crisis is going to be about Iraq, because whatever you're hearing, Iraq is going bad. Sunnis are killing Shia. It's sectarian war. And the big question is going to be whether we pull out or not. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to keep them. We've got 40 or 50,000 Americans there to keep them there. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I'll tell you right now, there are Sunni Ba'athist groups in Damascus, in various places. In the United Kingdom, Leeds is one place, ready as soon as we get out to declare an alternative government, a provisional government, and announce that they're going to retake Iran from the Shiites and from Iraq from the Shiites, who they believe are totally tied into the Iranians, which probably isn't true, but there's always been the fiction we have, or the fear we have. Iran controls Iraq. There's a mutuality of interest, but Maliki is a very tough customer. You know, Maliki worked for 21 years in Syria as a cop for the Mukhabara, for the secret police. He was working as a sergeant there for 21 years in Syria before he went back in as an exile after we kicked out Saddam. He is nobody's patsy. But there's going to be a holy hell there. It's going to be probably the biggest problem the president has next year, along with gas, along with the crazy Republicans that are running against him. He's going to, and along with Afghan, along with Iran, it's going to be Iraq. We're going to be back looking at Iraq as that country goes berserk.
Hersh,
I'm very cheerful. I'm really Mr. Happy News, huh?
I want to get back to the Arab Spring for a moment and ask you do you think that in Egypt, for example, the uprisings led to the overthrow of Mubarak and now to the trial, apparently the trial of Mubarak. It is understandable why the Egyptian people would want to put this ruthless leader on trial. But do you think that the trying of Mubarak has had repercussions throughout the rest of the region with all these other dictators who say, well, I better fight to the end because if not, I will end up like Mubarak, immediately put on trial by my people?
Well, you know, I can't say that about the trial because I haven't actually talked to anybody about whether the trial makes a difference. But before that, I would say what you're saying is absolutely right. The moment the United States, the waffling that the president did, if you remember, he was with the kids, he was against the kids, and we had the Secretary of the State saying the same thing, with, against. There's no question that there's an enormous fear in the Arab world, in the Gulf region. And right now they're very angry at us. They're terrified of Iran. And they're very worried about internal security. They're worried about what's going on in Bahrain I'm telling you, it's a sensationally underreported story. The brutality there is beyond, it's shocking. And again, the Saudis are directly involved, sort of with our okay. If you don't think Saudi Arabia has enormous control over Salah in Yemen, you're not paying attention. He's got enormous control over him. The Saudis, if the Saudis wanted to, they could play a very positive role there. They're not. He's their guy. And so you have this counter-revolution fed by the Saudi billions, and the Saudis went recently into Prince Bandar, my favorite dark prince, was recently in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis are supplying some thuggery, some arms, some muscle in Bahrain, and I think the Pakistanis are also helping out in internal security inside Saudi Arabia itself. And so everybody's muscling up now to beat up the kids who want to do something. And meanwhile, if you look at it, the single biggest blow against al-Qaeda, I would argue bin Laden, of course, was great, wonderful, I'm glad he's gone and all that stuff. But the other big blow was the Arab Spring. Because once you lose the sense of humiliation among the Arab population and the sense of fear, you're seeing that in Syria right now. Although that's also complicated because the Saudis are deeply involved in trying to get rid of, or certainly make it more difficult for Bashar Assad to exist. That's a more complicated position. But once the fear is gone, al-Qaeda's gone. So the one thing we had going for ourselves in terms of getting rid of these terrorists who prey on the frustrations of the Arab young, wow! Instead, we're going the wrong way. And it's a horrible mistake. It's happening right in front of us. It's not being seen, but it's right there to be seen. And it's just this country, this president, traditionally we've been unable to pull the trigger on the Saudis. Even now, when confronted with heinous activity, we still can't pull the trigger on the Saudis because of the need for oil. And again, this is a country, Saudi Arabia, that is not agreeing to lift 2 or 3 more billion barrels a day. They're at 8.5 billion. We'd love them to go to 11, 10.5 and 11. That would take pressure off the price. And it's politically useful for the president not to. For the president to have it happen, it's not going to happen. So Arab Spring is being undercut enormously. There's still some hope in Egypt because the kids are so strong, the movement there is so strong. But I can tell you, Suleiman, the leader of the intelligence service, is still there. I think an awful lot. I would look at Libya as part coming out of Arab Spring. An awful lot of it comes out of Libyan intervention. There's been a long-standing American CIA role in opposition to Gaddafi. And one of the things Gaddafi drove everybody crazy with, just to show you how silly the world is, every oil deal he wanted 20% on the top of. And so there was a lot of corporate anger at him, too. He was getting 20% kickback. Even Saddam in the heyday only wanted 10%. It all comes down sometimes to money. And I don't know what's going to happen there. I just don't know what's going to happen.
Seconds.
I don't quite...
We have 30 seconds,
okay.
But I want to ask you a last question. You made headlines a few years ago when you said President Bush operated an executive assassination ring. Has that policy continued under President Obama?
What I said was that in the early days under Cheney, in the first days after 03, 04, or 05, yes, there was a direct connection between the vice president's office and individuals getting hit. That got institutionalized later in a more sophisticated way. There's no question that, look, there's an enormous military apparatus out there that isn't seen. That's what I'm writing about. We're not seeing it. We don't know it exists. Cheney built up a world that still exists. And it's a very ugly, frightening world that has not much to do with what the Constitution calls for.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. This piece appears in the New Yorker magazine, and we will link to it. It's called Iran and the Bomb. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Haiti and WikiLeaks. Stay with us.
Tu voudrais que je chante encore le doux chant des petits oiseaux pour te plaire. Même quand j'entends des cris de mort qui sortent de nos cachots putrides, que je chante l'eau claire des ruisseaux, des rivières, devant l'Artibonite, rouge du sang de nos frères. Tu te dis pacifique, tu te dis apolitique, mon frère. T'aimes bien les chanteurs de charme, ça plaît bien aux belles dames. Quand elles tombent dans les pommes, ça ne fait de mal à personne.
Mano Charlemagne. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, this week, The Nation magazine published the first in a series of reports on more than 19,000 U.S. diplomatic cables on Haiti that were released by WikiLeaks. The series is a partnership with the Haitian weekly newspaper Et Liberté. The cables cover an almost 7-year period from April 2003, 10 months before the February 2004 coup, which ousted President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to February 2010, just after the earthquake that devastated the capital Port-au-Prince and surrounding cities. Meanwhile, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was yesterday awarded the 2011 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, an award recognizing factual journalism that exposes establishment propaganda or official drivel, as Gellhorn called it. The prize judges said in their citation that WikiLeaks' goal, quote, goal of justice through transparency is in the oldest and finest tradition of journalism.
The Haiti WikiLeaks report released this week exposes how the U.S. tried to interfere with and block an oil agreement between Haiti and Venezuela. We're joined now by the authors of the report called the Petro-Caribe Files, veteran Haiti correspondent Dan Coughlin and Haiti Liberté editor Kim Ives. Dan covered Haiti for the Interpress service from the United Nations and Port-au-Prince between 92 and 96. He's currently executive director of Manhattan Neighborhood Network. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Begin by talking about how you got these documents, Kim.
We got in touch with WikiLeaks, actually a coalition of journalists, and they essentially said we're going to provide to Haiti Liberté these documents, and we have 6 months to basically treat the 1,918 documents, and comes to about 6,500 pages.
So this is, in essence, a secret history of what's happened in Haiti now, because obviously the U.S. Embassy in Haiti has played such a huge role, sometimes a bigger role than the actual government, so most of the time.
Right, exactly. It's really amazing to see an ambassador pushing around a president and all his officials, telling them what to do, that they don't understand this, they don't understand that, trying to tell them what Haiti's interests are. It's the epitome of arrogance.
So you've gotten a bunch of documents, Dan. Talk about the focus of, and you're releasing them over a series of Wednesdays. Talk about this and the heart of this report.
Yeah, no, it's so important what Haiti Liberté and WikiLeaks have done, shedding light on what the U.S. does in Haiti. People don't understand about the dominant role that the U.S. plays there. It's the fourth largest U.S. embassy anywhere in the world. The UN mission in Haiti today is the third largest UN mission anywhere in the world. Haiti plays a pivotal role despite its small size in world history. And what these oil documents show, and especially from a U.S. perspective, when we in the United States, in our workplaces, in our homes, in our community groups, we're raising money for Haiti. We send money for earthquake victims. We send money for hurricane relief. Some of us with our churches go on missions to Haiti to help build the country. But what we realize in these cables that Haiti Liberté has released along with WikiLeaks is that, in fact, the main obstacle to development in Haiti today is Washington, is the U.S. Embassy. It was what they do to undermine development. And in this particular case with the oil deal with Venezuela, it was Chevron and ExxonMobil working with the U.S. Embassy to prevent an oil deal that had dramatic benefits for the Haitian people. $100 million a year for the Haitian government to spend.
For the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, they would save $100 million a year?
It's not just the $100 million a year, which is huge for Haiti. It's 10% of the Haitian government budget that they used for things like hurricane relief, for schools, for hospitals. The cables themselves admit that. It's not, quote-unquote, corruption. It's for direct support of the people.
And this is because Chavez was offering the oil at 40% off the world market price?
That's right. The deal is you get a certain, you only have to pay 40% of the cost of the oil up front.
60%.
Excuse me, 60% up front, and the rest on a 25-year, 1% a year deal. So you're essentially saving 40% of the cost of the oil, and you're using that for direct support to the people. But also, it's part of a package where you're getting electricity to Haiti, and this is something that even the U.S. Embassy recognized. In one cable, they wrote that this Petro-Carib deal is very good for the country, wrote the charge d'affaires for the U.S. Embassy in one of the cables. Port-au-Prince, Gonaïves, and Cape Haitian now have electricity thanks to Venezuela and Cuban technicians. Haiti receives shipments of Petro-Carib fuel every 2 weeks, and in addition to the 3 power plants already in operation and promises to modernize the airport in Cape Haitian, Venezuela's oil refinery project, etc. There's tangible benefits to the Haitian people, but Chevron, Mobil, ExxonMobil, and the U.S. Embassy tried to block this.
Well, one of the cables talked about that the Cubans wanted to replace 2 million light bulbs throughout Port-au-Prince at a cost of $4 million, but that would save Haiti I think $70 million annually in electricity costs, and yet the U.S. Embassy was opposed to it.
Yes, they're completely opposed to it, and it appears simply on geopolitical grounds. And they tell the Haitians this. What's interesting, the ambassador, Janet Sanderson, who's now Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, is going to...
She was Bush's ambassador.
She was Bush's ambassador. Now she's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She's going to Preval and the Haitians and telling them, you all don't understand how important our opposition to Venezuela is. Don't do this deal.
Yeah, they said that Venezuela and Cuba appear to be taking advantage of Haiti's electricity gap. That was another quote from Teague, and that this is being used for Venezuela and Cuba to expand their influence.
You know, this is very interesting because we were just down covering the return of the Honduran exiled president, Zelaya, back to Honduras after almost 2 years in exile. and very interesting comparisons to covering Aristide when he returned from South Africa to Haiti. But when we got to Tegucigalpa a few days ago, I talked to Zelaya's former Minister of Culture, Rodolfo Pastor-Fasquel, one of those who returned to Haiti with Zelaya. So many people went into exile, afraid for their lives. And I talked to him about the pressure that he described that was exerted on Honduras by the United States.
I was repeatedly approached by American military officers and diplomatic personnel who were trying to discover if I was unsure of myself or unrestful with what we were doing in government and what our plans were for the future. And repeatedly, the theme that came up was that our association with Chavez and Venezuela was or seemed such a threat and such a profoundly disgusting relationship to them, which I never understood why they would think that I would manifest myself against President Chavez. I may not like his personal style sometimes, but I respect him very much as a national leader of his own country, and I was very convinced, I am today as well, that the kind of aid President Chavez was giving our government through Petrocaribe and through ALBA was absolutely necessary at the time. But they were convinced that for ideological reasons, I would manifest myself in sympathy with their alarm.
And if you had, what was your feeling they would have done?
Well, maybe if I was a more sophisticated politician, I should have invented sympathy for their intentions and found out. I was not. I was always very clear and very definitive. What we're doing is what is convenient to our national interest. It is something that is absolutely necessary under the circumstances. If you don't want Petrocaribe to give us 40% credit on our oil bill, give us the credit, and we'll consider substituting their aid for your aid, which never came out.
That was Rodolfo Pastor-Fasquel, the former Minister of Culture under Zelaya, who went into exile and taught at Harvard and now has returned back to Honduras.
And of course, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and Honduras is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Kim Ives.
Well, it's interesting because in the longer version of the piece, which appears in Haiti Liberté, the longer version than the Nation piece, we look at the original proposal from Venezuela was actually made to the government of Gerard Latour II, which the U.S. installed, the puppet government, after the coup of 2004. And that government, they make clear in the cables, was very good in observing the rules and saying, oh, no, we're not going to take oil from Venezuela. We're going to go to Mexico. And in fact, Fox in Mexico had devised a plan called the Plan de Puebla or something to basically counter, explicitly, they state this in the cables, counter the Petrocaribe deal. So, this is a very interesting way they're trying to make a really counter-initiative to Venezuela's counter-initiative.
What was also interesting about what Pascal said is he said, if the U.S., if oil companies offered us this deal, we would go with them. But we're getting a deal. We're saying offer us an equivalent deal. Dan.
Yeah, what's remarkable, again, is that we have Venezuela and Cuba helping Haiti out. The Haitians say this is nothing ideological. We just want electricity and development for our country. And sure enough, what happens in a matter of years, Port-au-Prince, the main cities, most of the country, electricity production skyrockets. People now can read their books at night. Hospitals have power. Schools, factories, homes have electrical power that they didn't used to have under 50 years of U.S. development aid. All of a sudden, in 2 or 3 years, Venezuela and Cuban technicians come in, patch a few power stations together, 3 of them, bring in the oil supply, a steady oil supply that benefits Haiti, and sure enough, there's electrical power. So it's an extraordinary transformation that happened.
The hypocrisy is incredible because we see how important energy is to the well-being of any country. Just after Cy Hersh's interview, we see what they're doing in the Middle East. Haiti can't search for oil itself.
Kim, one thing I noticed that the cables articles that you've reported on so far show, they don't paint a very good portrait of Proval. In fact, Proval was constantly telling the U.S. Embassy that I really don't like Chavez. You know, I really didn't invite him. Right. But the embassy officials are saying he appears too weak to be able to stand up to his own people on issues like reaching a deal with Venezuela.
Well, really what Proval was using was an age-old Haitian tactic, which is called marronage, which is where you say one thing but you do another. And he was really playing the U.S., or what he thought he was playing. They ended up playing him because he was dealing with both sides. And as they say in Haiti, you had two candles for two saints, and the U.S. couldn't accept that. They said, you just have the candle for Washington, Ottawa, Paris. And so in that case, that's really why they've gone over to the Martelly camp, you know, who is a completely U.S.-centric guy who's, I think, maybe going to go after some of the Cuban and Venezuelan projects.
Let's talk about Michel Martelly for a minute, the new president of Haiti. We were down there all together, Dan and Kim, for this election. When Martelly came into power, within a few weeks, at least 3 camps housing approximately 1,000 Haitians displaced from the earthquake were destroyed by police in the Delma suburb of Port-au-Prince. And he has said he will restore the army. The significance of this?
Yeah, I think he's going to go after the people. He said in an interview that these people had homes, in fact, that they were using the camps to party. I think that's what he was saying to an Al Jazeera crew. I mean, his cynicism on that front is incredible. And here's a guy who was the principal cheerleader for the 1991 and the 2004 coups. I mean, he's made no bones about it that he's a representative and friend of the army.
And what is interesting in the cables, in 2006, when President Proval was elected, who was part of the Lavalas movement, the popular and democratic movement that overthrew military dictatorships, the Duvalier dictatorship in the 80s, tried to institute a kind of popular and nationalist democratic government over the last 20 years. Proval becomes inaugurated. His first meeting is with the vice president of Venezuela. And in the National Palace, in the big white National Palace in Port-au-Prince, a mile away is a tanker in the port carrying 100,000 gallons of fuel, diesel, and unleaded gas from Venezuela. The new president of Haiti, Michel Martelly, 5 years later, first meeting is with the Colombian foreign minister, and his plan is the Colombian plan. Sharp contrasts, the different poles of Latin America, Bogota, Mexico City, versus Havana, Brasilia, Caracas. This is the struggle that was happening, and that these cables that WikiLeaks and Haiti Liberté, which published, make so clear.
Talk about what's coming in these Wednesdays to come. You have all the documents now.
Well, we have a piece next week on the blocks about sweatshops and looking at really how the U.S. was fighting the $5 a day minimum wage, which was being clamored for by the population, and said, no, it should be $3 a day. They saw that as way excessive. We have stuff on the militarization of the earthquake response, because as we saw, Amy, when we went down, they were bringing guns, not gauze. We have incredible portraits of a lot of the MREs, morally repugnant elite, and
what you see in the cables already released up at WikiLeaks site, or going to Haiti Liberté's website, or even thenation.com, is extreme micromanagement of Haiti by the embassy. It's baffling how interested they are in micro details of anything happening in the country, or, as we've already seen in cables released, of President Aristide coming back. There was plans to try to stop his plane ride from South Africa, intercepted in West Africa or in Europe, to prevent him from coming back.
You were lucky, Amy, you didn't get caught in that. And they also had Cité Soleil under a microscope. I mean, going down to the individuals. They had the whole Lavalas movement under a microscope, looking at these people. So
and in the last few seconds, we have any sense that since President Aristide has returned, that the people's movement is beginning to reorganize itself?
Yes, it is. It's in very difficult straits, though, because they have the other team in power. And so I think, some people have said, why hasn't he spoken out more and been more? But he's, being very prudent, I think.
We're going to leave it there. Kim Ives and Dan Coughlin have put out these pieces in Haiti Liberté and The Nation, and we will link to them at democracynow.org. On Monday, we'll look at the life of Geronimo Pratt, the former Los Angeles Black Panther leader, who died at his home in Tanzania on Thursday, the focus of COINTELPRO in the 1970s. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. You can go to our website for more information on him. Stay with us. Thanks so much.